Hello, and welcome to today's Praxist Table Talk. My name is Vincent. I'm the founder and leader of Praxia, and today we're going to be discussing atheism, nihilism, and other such concepts as they contrast with the principles of theism, purpose, holism, and other such concepts that we espouse as Praxists. And joining me today, I have a very important member of our leadership council, Cody.
Hello again, everyone.
How are you doing?
A little manic, as you know, but hopefully I'll take that hyperness and focus it on today's episode.
Yes. I think you know what? This one is a good one to be manic on, because we have, we're touching upon a very big stark contrast between, us and like the people who think like us and people who think very much more materialistically and it kind of like the person of the modern age. You know what I mean? It's less philosophic, more of a we'll get into it. We'll get into it. But
yeah, I think if I can introduce it, a good way of trying to explain what we mean in this episode is taking this materialistic view of the world that we harp against so much and really not boxing it in, but doing our best to explain it while leaving the fringes and edges of this definition up for, I guess, transmission.
yeah,
Because it's as we try to define things and box things in, you'll get hyperfixated on definitions, and then they'll be pigeonholed into that meaning. And we always want to leave a little room for bleeding edges, because everything kind of overlaps with other aspects of life and philosophy and so on. And so what we see as the problems with these materialistic, nihilistic, atheistic points of view in the world, even the scientific, or as we like to be precise and say, the scientism of the world today, is part of what's wrong in at least the symptomatic application of these spiritual problems that we as praxists are trying to solve and get down to a definitive cure, or at least not a cure, but a process in which to, alleviate the stresses of this Kali Yuga, as everyone likes to call it.
yeah.
And I feel like that is overused at times, but that's this deterioration of the world before our eyes seems to just be easy or convenient to use that as a term.
Yeah.
But we do want to limit things so as not to just have the words lose their meaning as well.
Yeah, exactly. It is kind of a word that is thrown around a lot without much care and meaning given to it. And I actually think that as we go on, we'll probably discuss some of the folks who do use that term in the wrong sense, or in at least they use it and they don't offer any substantial alternative or opposition to it that doesn't fall within the same category as the principles which characterize the Kali Yuga itself. But yeah, I guess a good way of describing the topic of the episode as well is taking those ideas of atheism, nihilism, materialism, these more relative worldviews, and deconstructing them and finding within them the pieces that justify the orientation of the modern man. I guess it could be like a deconstruction of modern man, if you will, the modern mentality at the very least.
Well, be careful with that. We'll get accused of being postmodernists.
That's true. But yeah, we'll be discussing our worldview and orientation in contrast with the orientation and worldview with one of more materialistic dispositions. And I think one good way of characterizing it would be to contrast our more holistic worldview that considers the all. I would give that a capital A as well, the all, in that everything within reality has some kind of innate correspondence with everything else in reality. And I'll get into the details of that a little bit later as well. And then contrasting that with someone who has a more singular worldview, or a worldview of numerosity, which is another way I like to characterize relative worldviews.
Yes, the reign of quantity. And who is the was it a writer, philosopher? I forget who coined that again. I always want to make sure I have my sources on.
Reign of Quantity was Guénon.
Was Guénon?
Yeah, he actually called his book that.
Good.
It was The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times.
Okay, good. Because I think there was an English writer too that used that same term around the same time. So it seemed to be a bit of a synchronicity in that aspect.
Oh yeah.
As is much the ways of the world today. And that's, we may get into synchronicities sometime else, but that's something to keep your ear out for when people say. To introduce the episode beyond this introduction, funny enough, I guess we could bring about its inspiration. And that was a dialogue I had online with this fellow. And it really exemplifies what we mean when contrasting these holistic and more metaphysical understandings of the world versus these very low resolution materialist views of the world, and how there needs to be some sort of reconciliation between this reign of quantity in the average man and this deeper understanding of the spirit in circles like ours. And it started off around that specifically, where this person has an account by the name of Atheists Against Fairy Tales or something like that. Some very edgy, provocative, 2012 sort of new atheist type of provocation. And they made a post quoting or misquoting a passage from the Bible and then caricaturizing that with a cartoon and like, oh, some cannibalism or something to misrepresent what it was actually saying. And the actual passage was on the, I have to look into it again, but it was like some monologue of God declaring his wrath against some sect of people that have sinned against him, as the Sodom and Gomorrahs of the world go, the fall of Babylon and so forth.
Right.
And it was taken out of that context and taken a little too literally. And so a lot of people just wanted to trash him and own him in a sense, just like that 2012 mentality, new atheist, like, owned, Ben Shapiro compilation, owned, libtarder, that sort of low IQ mob mentality, which I found quite displeasing, that people who wanted to be professors of Christ or followers of Christ in that sense would be so demeaning to someone who in actuality, the burden is to try and save that person.
Right.
And that's, in my mind, what I wanted to do in this situation. And so I was very respectful and just trying to give an olive branch over to this person and explain, like, hey, I'll pray for you to hopefully come to a better understanding of things. I was much like yourself when I was young, and it took me a long time and a long march of intellectual discomfort to come to the more spiritual side of things. And I'm still not all the way there. I don't even know if I'm halfway through my journey, but I'm far further down the road than when I first started as like a 12-year-old myself, just burgeoning onto the scene of the internet and reading people like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens and the rest of the Four Horsemen. I always forget the third guy. It's Hitchens, Dawkins, Harris, and then some other fellow that I never really got into all that much. But the typical new atheist movement. And I even went so far as to recommend a video that was describing everything I was saying to this fellow in a much more succinct and detailed way by the distributist. And that was his video called The Cult of Confidence and the Problem with the New Atheist Movement, and how the distributist, Dave, went through much the same phases earlier in the 2000s, albeit for him, because he's an older fellow, and how he himself came away from that scientific point of view of reality, or the scientific conception of viewing reality, in this sort of God of gaps type of idea, where the fringes of science that we can understand of the world around us are then pushed further as like, oh, that's just God's work, if you're unfamiliar with the argument.
Right.
And that's a bit where this fellow was coming from in his point of view. But the real concerning part was that each of us had watched this video 2 or 3, and myself almost 4 times, because how we were communicating our perception of the video, looking at the same thing from the same point of view, or well, I guess not the same point of view, but looking at the same thing repeatedly over and over again, and then communicating our points of view to each other, it seemed like we had watched 2 completely different videos. I even accused him of not watching it at all, but as he said he promised me to rewatch it, he did write a whole list of notes and contentions with this video and what I was saying, and it seemed so fundamentally disparate from how I viewed things and how the distributist was trying to convey himself, that I still haven't been able to respond to him and present myself in such a way where he might understand what it is he's missing. And there is like fundamental gaps of understanding there. But that's kind of the problem with most people in society today, is that they're so conditioned and so whittled down in the myopia and the physicality of things that they can't conceive past a certain point, past that point of confidence that it exists within this material world of facts and quantity and data-driven analysis, that they misunderstand or throw away entirely other conceptions of truth and understanding the world, like what the ancients had once mastered. They didn't solve, but they did have a mastery of it, like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, like many of the other founders of philosophy and the politicians and other such figures like Marcus Aurelius or Machiavelli, or even the Enlightenment liberals that were on this borderline between the material conception of the world, because they did exist in this time of the scientific revolution, and this pre-existing notion of other questions that humanity has been presented with, or that we've asked, that we're still trying to answer. Things like, what is beauty? Is there a God? Are there parallel universes?
Why are we here?
Things like that. Why are we here? Is there a point to existence? And other non-scientific questions that are expressed in non-scientific means and in philosophies and in the metaphysical quandaries of us today in the sort of right sphere of things, and of our ancestors going down the perennial lineage, and what people like Evola and his other contemporaries tried pointing out, which is why we bring him up so often.
Yeah.
And this guy just didn't understand that at all. And I kept trying to be very careful in explaining this and being very precise with my words, not trying to use any loaded language or be disrespectful or dismissive in any way. And he persistently, it seemed like I was coming at it from, my understanding is that he thought I was coming at things from a point of bad faith or dishonesty or something like that. That's the only way I could really rationalize how he was combating everything I was saying, what the distributist was saying as well. And there's this point of insincerity that is plaguing society, and just outright misunderstanding of reality from this myopic material point of view that is part of the reason, or at least symptomatic of the reasons causing this devolution in this Kali Yuga that everyone is pointing to now. And they might be pointing at like, oh, we're in the stage of the Kali Yuga, but still in these very material, very low resolution mindsets, but are totally reactionary in the wrong sense. in combating these things, thinking that the answer to liberalism is neo-fascism or something of that flavor, or
Right.
something else entirely, is double down on liberalism and let's try and get that gay space luxury communism that we've always been rooting for, like the leftists who've been getting funded online constantly are propagandizing.
Right.
And it's these issues that we're hoping to maybe figure out or bridge gaps to that are very, very concerning for society overall, because if you can't even have a conversation with the average person about the same thing that you're looking at, and you have such wildly different conceptions of the substance of that thing, even if you agree in essence what it is, like him and I both agreed on some of the fundamental points of what the distributist was saying, because like there's only so much wiggle room you have in the language that we're communicating in. But outside of that, it almost didn't matter on those agreements, because the substance around it was so vastly different and even diametrically opposed to each other that I just couldn't figure out how to bridge those communication gaps.
Yeah. I remember looking, because I did see the post and I did see your conversation, and I saw this is not much the fault of your own. Like, this is not much your fault. This is the fault of the people, especially in religious communities, who really don't live up to what they preach. One large part of being religious in any case is to follow this idea of the way. I'm going to give this quote here about Praxism and how we usually try to characterize it in writing. And that, number one, it is that there is a fundamental presupposition to Praxism, and that is that there is a singular divine principle or monad, which is the source and vitality of existence, including the rules and ways in which this monad interacts within itself. And then relating to humanity, there is fundamentally a law that must be followed, or a law that must be obeyed, and a way that must be followed, right? So you have the rules set forth by this, monistic principle, and then you have to follow these rules. That's one of the fundamental presuppositions to what Praxism is. And then also, as you see Praxism characterized in these various religions, it's the fundamental presupposition to religiosity, is to be a good person, not vaguely in the sense that new atheists like to poke fun at Christians and say just love your neighbor and be hunky-dory and things like that, but actually genuinely be a good person. One of the biggest pieces of the church's doctrine is be Christ-like. And while the definitions of Christ-like differ from various interpretations within Christianity, the fundamental idea is that you have to, at the very least, want to help. You have to want to enlighten or assist in some way. And so what this means is that, when it comes to cases of adversity, you should not be brash and abrasive, but you should be embracive. You should try to embrace the difference, not in a in a progressive sense, but embrace the difference between you and what is who your opponent is, and then try to bridge that gap somehow. Try to enlighten them, because to be religious in the truest and most proper sense, not by following dogma, but by actually believing in the principles, not even by faith, but by actually understanding the principles, is to
By honor.
Yeah, exactly. It's to be of a higher mentality. It's to be of an enlightened status. And so to try to enlighten other people would be your duty as that, as that holder of that information. And so, I was looking at the post that you were talking about, and indeed, almost every other person who disagreed, because, the post was made on a space where atheism is not very popular. And so, it was a very disagreeable post to begin with, posted in a sphere, obviously with the intent to provoke the people within the sphere. It's very obviously the case. And so obviously people were not happy with it, but they commented, kind of like mocking the guy, mocking the atheist. And there's the ratio meme that goes around where the comment gets more likes than the post because it shows how many people disagree with the post. There were so many people doing that, and to some degree, like, it's mob mentality. It's the making the joke at someone else's expense, and of course that expense is going to be the outsider, and that's just natural humor. But more fundamentally, you should want to not be so provocative. You should want to, like, you shouldn't react to the provocation. It was obviously meant to be, like, the post was obviously made with the intent to incite a reaction, and it seems that most people were having that reaction that was desired. It was there to troll, really. And obviously the main poster didn't comment on any of these reactionary comments, but to yours he did. He responded to you. Not only did he respond to you, but he had a pretty lengthy discussion with you in the comment section of his own post, talking about, like, it was very in-depth. It was like scientific concepts, metaphysical and philosophic concepts right there in the comment section, where everyone else he kind of ignored. And
Yeah.
I feel like if those comments didn't exist, if he didn't get such a reaction, or if he didn't have the experience of having that reaction from various religious people, probably with whom he's interacted, which probably solidified his worldview more so than any logical argument could, then he would have responded better to you, I think. You get what I'm saying? I think he would have responded more positively to you.
I'm not so sure, because everything you're saying too, and I wanted to add on to, is that everything we're saying isn't easy. Like, it is very hard to uphold ourselves to those higher principles, to adhere to that honor, especially in an honorless age where people don't trust each other anymore, where it's this paranoia that everyone else is out to get you, or that even if you may agree with things aesthetically or politically, it's like, oh, what if this guy's a Fed or something like that? And we have to really grit our teeth and move past those ideas and those paranoias, as true and dangerous as they might be, because, like Vincent was saying, in this space, this atheist fellow was getting ratioed, but in reality, where we're standing in these more post-reactionary fields, these perennial fields, these deeper philosophical, traditional, religious mentalities of things, we are the minority. And the ratio, air quote, as it would be, comes in with much more dire consequences, considering that us being dissidents of the system as is incredibly dangerous. We've seen that with all sorts of different public displays of dissident thought contemporarily. And so it is hard to embody all of these principles, especially when we do act in such a mob mentality. But sans all of that, even if it was just him and I in this conversation, in this dialogue, I don't think he would have been any more or less receptive to what I was saying, because of when I did take things and move them away from the public display in this comment section. I was addressing him in the DMs and trying to direct message him so it's a much more refined and private space, so that he could at least be a little more comfortable, and there wasn't going to be anyone else coming in and disrupting the conversation we did have. Because, like Vincent said, I was the only one he responded to. That being said, the conversation completely devolved because of how fundamentally different he was already thinking. Who have posted the things he posted, and regardless of the other vitriol he received, he exists in this temporal aspect of things, where this wave of new atheism and whatnot has kind of died off now, but it's simmered across society, like how a tsunami waves over the beach and floods the surrounding coastline. And now it's receded a bit, but those floodwaters have stayed, almost like the sea level has risen in light of this tsunami. And so now a new coastline is carved out by this cataclysm of the ocean. And that's kind of what the whole new atheist movement has done to the religious space on a societal level. And that's where I think he's been a victim of in that aspect, alongside other things, because it is a very cross-dimensional aspect of society that we live in, where there's more than just this one aspect of things. But I'm kind of being repetitious.
Right. No, you are correct. It is a fundamentally different worldview. It's like that hourglass analogy that I keep referencing. You have it's fundamentally two different sets of semantics, and just to kind of rehash that, in case anybody hasn't heard the analogy, it's essentially, if you picture an hourglass, you have two kind of basins of sand connected by a small tube in the middle, and consider one end of the hourglass would be traditional semantics, and the other end of the hourglass would be anti-traditional semantics, or materialistic semantics, or whatever it may be that you want. And these semantics, for the worldview of someone who is of a traditional orientation, our worldview, or the worldview of the Praxist even, or the classical theologist, is one that traces things back to their most fundamental source and essential principle. It's the one that says, okay, well, it is that, that presupposition that there is a monad, that there is a law that must be obeyed and a way that must be followed. There are actualizations that need to happen. It's a consideration. It's a very holistic consideration of reality, almost in the sense that you see temporal reality for what it is, which is essentially a symbol and a dramatization at best of these various metaphysical principles. And so, it entirely relates to function, preordainment, castes, hierarchy, things like that, intrinsically within reality. And then, for anti-traditional semantics, I guess for traditional semantics, the most qualitative aspect is absolutity. And then for anti-traditional semantics, they exist entirely in relativity. It's very much like you said, it's, zoomed in. It's hyper-focused on the material. And it doesn't see temporal reality or physical reality as a symbol or a dramatization or even a manifestation itself. It sees physical reality as the thing, as the thing that ontologically is. And then beyond this, it sees relativity as the ultimate end, and the ultimate beginning as well. So what you have for anti-traditional semantics is a focus on individuality, and for in the humanist sphere, you have what induces a positive reaction or a positive feeling, even if that may be artificial. You have things like interchangeability. It's funny because the anti-traditional semantics really amount to one amorphous blob, but it really is based in relativity. That's what I'm trying to get at. And so the hourglass analogy, you have one end that has traditional semantics and the other end that has anti-traditional semantics. And the sand in the middle, the sand for the hourglass, would be the substance of society. And so you flip the hourglass one way or the other, and the sand trickles down from the basin it was in into the basin that it's going into. And so it takes time to do that. That would be the relative aspect of time. And so, with more traditional societies, the traditional side of the hourglass was on the table. The sand was in it. It was because it was oriented that way for long enough. And then around the atheistic era, I would say around the time of the Enlightenment, but really anywhere in which atheism becomes prevalent, anti-tradition becomes prevalent, and materialism takes hold, you can consider that hourglass as being flipped. Now, the substance of society, the sand, is still at the top, still in the traditional side, but over time, it piles up on the bottom. More and more of the substance becomes more materialist, more anti-traditional, more relative and secular and things like that. And so, that's why you see varying degrees of religiosity within post-Enlightenment society, even though post-Enlightenment society itself is entirely anti-religious, just by principle. So that's the analogy. But there's a joke that I made also before. You've seen the memes with the stairs going one way and the stairs going the other way, and one is ascending and one is descending. I've made this joke. There is two paths for the interested in philosophy, the ones who are interested in philosophy. There is the downward path and the upward path. And the downward path follows the path of materialism, then it devolves into secularism, and then it devolves into nihilism, and then it devolves into ultimately everything means nothing. And so that's the conclusion of the materialistic philosophy, is that everything means nothing. And then you have, if you want to go on the upwards path, you have, spiritualism, religiosity on that ascending level, metaphysics, theology. Then you have Meister Eckhart's statement that God is no thing, and therefore so God is nothing because he is beyond everything, but God is also everything. So then the conclusion of that would be that nothing means everything. So the conclusion for the ascetic or the religious would be that nothing means everything, and the conclusion for the materialist is everything means nothing. And so it's a joke I make to characterize these two various trains of thought, but the humorous aspect does have some validity in it. You are dealing with two different sets of semantics, like I said, so trying to convince someone to hop over to the other side, or to cross that barrier, or even to try to examine the same, like you said, the same piece of information, examine the same observable source of information, could lead to two radically different things, because the semantics is either nothing means everything, and therefore everything means everything, or everything means nothing. And so, no matter what it means, no matter what you are seeing, it ultimately means nothing. So when you're saying that there are some questions that don't need answering, or when he was saying that there are some questions that don't need answering, that is fundamentally against everything that the religious person would say, because every question needs answering in that regard. So it's two fundamental different ways of looking at it, So that's probably one of the barriers.
To add in the context, because the people don't know about the conversation further.
That's when right. I forgot you told that to me off call.
Yes. When this atheist fellow and I were discussing things privately on viewing this video several times over, and then communicating our perspectives on it and how fundamentally different they are, there is a point in the distributor's video where he has this box of knowledge in the conceivable universe, and he put in those questions that we had before. And one of the I don't even know to call it a misunderstanding or just rejection entirely, but this fellow addressed these questions that science can't answer as nobody's claiming the non-scientific questions. This is verbatim, the quote. Nobody is claiming that the non-scientific questions can be answered scientifically, but he assumes that these questions need answers. They don't. Some questions have no answer. And that's a very odd contradiction there, because there's a very, very stark difference between a question that you can't answer because you don't know, or you lack the ability to gain that knowledge, something that would require a certain omnipotence like God, versus something that doesn't need an answer, where it can be ignored, and it can be there's no value to it, or there's no purpose to ask that question in the first place, which seems strange because, okay, some things might be implicit or instinctual, like we get at sometimes with the certain blood memories that exist in man, and this primordial being that is derived from the monad, these universal truths that we get at. But even though some of those things are implicit, there is the explicit asking of that question in the first place, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. And that's why those questions are needed to be asked and answered in the first place. And so that was one of the biggest things that really concerned me in talking with this chap, because he just outright rejected that these questions, some of these fundamental gnawing realities that humanity hasn't had an answer for since we've asked them, since the dawn of civilization, and even before that which we know of, we've been asking these questions because they need an answer, and that otherwise there wouldn't be a question in the first place, if that makes sense. And so him kind of in the same breath flip-flopping on there doesn't need to be an answer and there is no answer is kind of strange, because it almost seems implicit that he understands that these things need answers, but because there isn't one from his scientific materialist point of view, that means they could be disregarded, because the method in which we answer questions cannot address these immaterial questions that were presented to him. Therefore, anything that's immaterial is non-existent in his mind. And that's where I really tried challenging him, and he didn't have an answer for it. It's like, well, then what is art in its conceptual sense? Like there is no definitive expression of it, but it is one of the most human concepts you could have, and it is one of the most vital expressions that a person can give. And that even bleeds into the Nietzschean ideal of things, but with the Dionysian and the Apollotian idea of art, and how it is one of the purest, rawest forms of humanity outside of being human ourselves. And there was no real acknowledgement of that question from him, which was very concerning. And I kept trying to press him on the issue on, okay, well, why do we do these things at all? They're completely irrational. They're completely unscientific. They represent things that aren't materially present in our reality, at least within the material world, within the atoms and molecules of our temporal existence. But they hit on metaphysical questions, or they represent metaphysical questions in this medium of the material world, whether that be through song or painting or sculpture or play or poem or whatever have you, whatever sensation we can experience this art from, this manipulation of the material world into a representation of the immaterial. There was no reconciliation of that fact when he denied them. He just dismissed it outright and said, oh, well, that's not relevant. And it was very, very concerning, because rejecting such a large portion, some of the most carnally human, that's the only way I can say it, that the most carnally human aspects of humanity, and just rejecting them outright seems incomplete and almost, and for lack of a better term, insane. And this is how this guy was viewing the world as is. And that's how a lot of people in our society are seeing things, and why we're so far past the point of conversation and so far past the point of reconciliation with some of these things, because there's no convincing or engaging in dialogue that these people would understand. Even if we're speaking the same language and using the same words, the mind's eye image of these things, the pure raw form and substance of them, almost corrupt the very essence of it. It's almost like an invasion of the Socratic form of this thing, and dissolves it entirely, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, and you were talking about various things which fall into the gaps of things which cannot be qualitatively described physically. Like you're talking about
Quantitatively.
Quantitatively described physically. You're talking about art and love and things like that. And another one of those things. So I guess it's way too long now. It's way too long. I was going to say at the beginning of the video that there's a series of videos that I watched called A Defense of Classical Theology by Mathoma, who's a mathematician / theologian on YouTube. And this series of videos, I just ran into it the other day, but this series of videos really does a good job at presenting the arguments to, like in a clear-cut and logical fashion. But one of the arguments that he presents against naturalism is that let me find it here. I just had it up, but I was looking through some other ones. Okay, he says, he gives two premises. Because the brain is the same as the mind, in the naturalist point of view, because naturalism would view the brain as the same as the mind, because it's all matter. So the fundamental presupposition to naturalism would be that everything is fundamentally matter, and so everything from love and beauty and all of that stuff is just receptive. It is inducive of a reaction, and then that reaction is materially and quantitatively defined, if that makes sense. So the premise that he gives is premise 1: because the brain is the same as the mind, in order for a brain to possess original intentionality, it would have to be true that a chunk of matter is directed beyond itself and is about another chunk of matter. And so then premise 2 would be chunks of matter cannot be about other chunks of matter. And so then the conclusion would be the brain does not possess original intentionality and thoughts because it is, and its associated thoughts aren't actually about anything, because things can't be about other things. So the question being asked here is, what is the quality of being about something? That is something that can only be metaphysically defined. And so that's the problem that naturalism falls into, is that it has no answer for these questions. Not just art, but, what is the action of perceiving?
What is moral, even?
Exactly. Well, yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother debate, but that is a good question.
Yeah, but that's one of those questions,
right? It is one of those metaphysical. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. What I wanted to add with that is that this is an issue that many people in our spheres have been explaining, or at least trying to explain, but they're sort of failing the translation of that into these people who hold this materialist point of view. I've heard the distributist, Owen Benjamin, academic agent, and many people orbiting them or around their spheres that have all said more or less the exact same thing, which is we are looking at material solutions to a spiritual problem. And there's a lot of that synchronicity going on, even if they are aware or not of each other. Vox Day and VDare or whoever else on the online spheres. Oh, sorry, Windows open. Whoever else in these online spheres are saying those same things. But what is being fundamentally misunderstood is that you need to translate those spiritual solutions into a physical form, one, in order for these materialist people to understand it, and two, the medium in which we interact with the world, in which we live and die by, no matter how much we can philosophize or dream about it, for lack of a better term, is the material essence of things. Like, no matter how well thought out and planned and true a spiritual solution might be, it has to be actualized. Like what Vincent was saying earlier on, and what I was touching upon earlier on too, with these, I guess I can call them fall Christians, completely disregarding their duty to act in that Christ-like vision of what they should be doing in proselytizing themselves and in their own moral duty to avoid sin and avoid their own hubris, to act like Christ. That is very much the case in all aspect of things, because Christ was this, at least if you're going to look at it conceptually, like how Jordan Peterson does it, is this grand fusion of that spiritual ascension and the physical manifestation to be exemplified by. So it is able to bridge that gap, but now that the historical aspects of things and the distance in time we are away from a figure like Christ, people have just disregarded it as a myth entirely. And so as true as we see the Christian narrative to be, it can't be the only narrative in which we rely upon, because we will have those materialistic minded people just disregarding it from the onset, whether it be from their own personal mental vaults where there's some traumatic event associated with those communities, or from some half-baked intellectualism that is attacking things that seem implausible or impossible from a scientific standpoint, because the scientific method and the growing scientism around it is very confident and easily demonstrated in the material world. They reject the more immaterial aspect of these things, and that's where I really want to try and bridge that gap, because as an example, there's this ongoing dispute between different content creators, well within our sphere on the perennial traditional rightist side of things, and then kind of on the fringes of that with a duo called Adam and Sitch, and they're streamers or YouTubers, whatever you want to call them, that were very much anti-progressive in the political sense, and made their height in 2016, 2017, making response videos and streams, taking apart these different progressives, much like the Ben Shapiro-owned compilations, like we were pointing at before, and how not to act when dealing with these situations. And they are now coming to a head against these more right spiritual side of spheres, because they are those very materialistic oriented types of people too. And people whom they previously got along with, like the distributist and academic agent, they're now having very fierce and personal debates and confrontations with over some of these issues, because there's a fundamental lack of understanding that there is a spiritual side of things, and there needs to be spiritual solutions to these spiritual problems, which is motivating the decay of our civilization, which they agree to on essence, like how I was saying, there's some essence of recognition, like between myself and that atheist fellow I was having a conversation with. It's the same here with Adam and Sitch and these other thinkers on our side of things, where we understand there's a problem here, but they have a completely different conception of what is causing that and the solutions thereof. And they don't understand that their idea of these things are completely, I wouldn't want to say complete fabrications, but misunderstandings of reality, because there's a gap in their knowledge, or at least their willingness to accept different forms of knowledge outside of this very material purview of things. And that's what I want to challenge people in our spheres to try and accomplish, because we need to have that bridging of the gaps of the spiritual and material side of things, because that's how I came to this viewpoint, and Jordan Peterson was a very large part of that process myself, even though someone like Vox Day has very damning problems with someone like Peterson. And I understand those too, but there needs to be a reconciliation there, a more, I don't want to say concession or meeting in the middle of sorts, but an understanding that attacking people that are the victims of these material institutions and propaganda machines isn't the way to go, especially when they've helped people like myself over those gaps where they are stuck on the other side of still themselves.
Right.
And that's what I hope Vincent now may be able to rein me in on.
Oh no, you went off the deep end. But yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, just listening to you talk about it. It makes a lot of sense what you're talking about. I was actually going to plan on asking you later on, because, both of us have this experience. Like both of us have this, I think we're kind of similar in that we grew up in more or less semi-religious households. At the very least, religion was the default, whether or not it was actively pushed and pursued. We still celebrated the holidays and still went to church more or less, and
Oh, well, my family was Jehovah's Witness, so they didn't.
Oh, well, I didn't know that.
But yes, more or less, though. You're getting to that point.
Generally speaking, there was a religious disposition in our childhood. We grew up with that. And then around, at least for me, it was early teens. I don't know about you, but for me, it was early teens. I was just, I wouldn't say I was a staunch atheist. I was never like, no, there is no God. But what I was rather agnostic or deist, in the sense that I didn't know and I didn't care. And it was cool to not know and not care. And therefore, if I wanted to be cool, I had to follow this not knowing, not caring trend. You know what I mean? And then, after that, we come into our late teens, our 20s, and we find our way back to this. We've come full circle back to this religiosity. And, not only have we come back full circle, but we've experienced the same things, and we've experienced this kind of heightened knowledge. So now not only do we have the same religious dispositions that we had when we were children, but we have rather a higher understanding of this religiosity. It's more concrete and less arbitrary. It is one of those things that fundamentally, once you have the understanding, cannot be questioned because it is ontologically based. And so, did you want to tell your story about how that kind of changed for you? And then I was going to tell mine as well. So.
Oh, sure. And that's why you kind of corrected yourself there too, because I wanted to say it's not necessarily coming full circle because we're in a different position than where we started off from.
Yeah.
And that's why I said, well, we have a better understanding than what our childish conceptions or the image pushed on us when we were children were of these things. And I'd say it's like finding yourself out of a maze where in the middle, like you say, you're starting off in the middle and you have to find your way out. The truth will be lying for you there, right at the gates of the exit. And so there'll be points when you're going around the maze where you are much closer to that exit, but there's still walls and bushes and whatever else that is impeding your progress to just cut across and get to the exit. And so you have to go a roundabout way, and you'll have to walk further away from that proverbial exit itself. And that's much like what adolescence is, in a sense. And as children, we'd have this innocent sort of conception of God or religiosity, what is presented to us, even if we don't fully understand it or can't fully express it. But there is an innocence and closeness to God there, which is something that Owen Benjamin talks about a lot too in the observations of his own children and other children in the Bertaria group, which even I've seen personally interacting with these people on meetups. And there is this sort of innate connection through that innocence and purity of childhood, where you are far closer to that exit, that truth. But because you are a child, you don't have the intellectual ability to be able to express those things or to fully understand or actualize those things and then hold on to them. And so adolescence moves away from that, and where you've become less innocent and for a time cynical to the world and paranoid because everything's out to get you again. But that's just a bit of growing up in a way. And because you do get older, you have an expanded intellectual capacity. Now you start to ignore your instinct in a way, and you're intelligent enough to ignore your instinct for all the wrong reasons. And that's where hubris comes into play.
Right.
And so now we've gone in that roundabout way, where we're on the opposite side of the maze, the furthest we can be from the exit. And then as we start approaching the exit again and find we get to that further, deeper understanding. And now we know the direction where we need to be going, and we're not lost anymore. We just need to make that last trek towards this understanding of truth, which for the most part, none of us will really be able to ever escape the maze, but we'll have confidence in knowing that we were setting our descendants up for a better head start than where we were.
Yeah,
that was kind of off topic, but
oh no, you're good. That was
how I came to things. It was much earlier than my teens, but it was similar to that sort of, it's not irreverent, but kind of like a dismissive mentality of whatever.
Yeah.
I don't really care type of deal. And it did develop eventually into a very staunch, almost rabid type of debate me bro atheism that I was into. That was somewhat influenced by my older sister, because she was a bit older than me. She was the oldest of our family, like kids-wise, obviously. And I looked up to her a lot. I agreed with her, or I got along with her a lot. And so I spent a lot of time with her growing up. And she, in her intellectual seniority, went through that atheist phase herself. And she still is that, despite her being much older now, because she kind of exists in that materialist point of view that we're getting at. And so I followed along unwittingly in that regard, because there very much was, when I was very young, that enforcement of religiosity, especially in this the Church of I forget what the exact name for Jehovah's Witnesses are, but it's different from just the Witnesses.
Latter-day Saints, right?
No, that's Mormons.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm bad with my sects.
But, yeah. And there very much was that enforcement and things, and so I did have this residual or vestigial type of spirituality there, but I quickly grew out of it once I started approaching adolescence, and I was kind of bitter to it, because I was like, oh, all these dumb people that could just use science, bro. It's like, oh, our ancestors were dumb, sort of more animalistic types of people. Very much the idea of these, I don't want to even call them intellectuals, but these sciencey types, like the Dawkins and Hitchens and
like pseudo-intellectuals.
People, yeah, even people as intelligent, and they do have genuine intelligence behind them, like Stephen Hawking, but there is just the specificity in their degree. Like, they might be very, very well versed in this specific thing, but outside of that, they might be complete idiots in almost every other regard. And that's very much the case in a lot of ways, especially when it comes about in this atheism. And when I realized that there were questions I couldn't answer, and there were prospects that I've been lied to about with regards to the spiritual end of things, or even the scientific end of things, and I realized that science wasn't as infallible as a method as I once thought it was. This ideal structure on which is ironclad and is kind of self-sustaining and self-correcting type of deal. I realized that the hearts of man are far more corrupt and will misuse this tool regardless, and at times it will go completely unchecked, and when challenged for pursuit of the truth, it will be quashed for political or ideological or spiritual reasons from all different directions. And so I kind of distanced myself and was in this sort of purgatory of what to think ideologically for myself. And this was in a very dark period of my time as well, personally, for different reasons, both familially and romantically for different aspects, but I won't indulge in any of those details. So it was all of these different aspects of me kind of crumbling down, and then I just went, you know what? Let's not care about that. Let me just get myself physically situated and then build up upon that. And then I did do that. I got a job and started getting myself situated and started getting myself ready for a university degree and really following my dreams in that regard. And through that, being that more intellectually honest type of person, more open to these ideas, and reading people like Peterson, and discovering crowds like the Distributist and his circles online, I started to shed the mold of that atheist phase. And I wasn't fully convinced, and I don't know if I still really am. And there's that 90s era of pure irony and insincerity that plagues a lot of people even to this day, like the Daria or the how would you say the what's another good example of like popular media in that very ironic, sarcastic, irreverent type of disposition? Would you say, Vincent?
You mean from like the period of the 90s?
90s, early 2000s, things that we see today on the like that would be a good example other than just Daria, because I actually haven't watched that show, but I've heard other people from the 90s like Academic Agent or Distributist refer to it as such.
Well, if you're talking about like just pieces of pop culture and pieces of media, you have everything from sitcoms like Friends and like
Seinfeld is a good one too.
yeah,
even.
Seinfeld, yeah.
So things like that.
Yeah.
And so I had a bit of that still vestigially latching onto me, like how that vestigial spirituality was there when I was very, very young. And now that's shedding too into this much more solidified and matured understanding of spirituality and of the world as we know it, far outside just being pigeonholed into this realm of scientism and the material quantity. So now I'm getting closer to that exit of the maze.
Right. That makes sense. So it's like it's not a 100% fully there yet, but it's a grasping of what has yet to be understood, or maybe what may yet never be understood.
Yeah.
Yeah. My situation was kind of the same. With my mom, it was, I would still say that she considers herself a Christian, regardless of whether or not every word in the Bible is taken as gospel is a different story, and how it's even taken. But regardless, growing up, she did take me to church. I did celebrate, religious holidays in the sense that they were actually religious, instead of being that consumerist mentality, there was actual meaning behind the various holidays, and there's a spiritual side to things like Christmas and Thanksgiving and things which we've touched upon before. I think, kind of like almost like a mystique of things that were to come in that time period. And so I do remember a lot of Christmases as a kid. For some reason, I just think that's what my mind defaults back to is Christmas and the winter time, because that was a time where we did go to church a lot, and then there were like readings of the Bible and things like that. I do remember that the church went a little all out every Christmas for a couple of years, the years that we went at least, and then it was just good times and happy memories from that time period. So I do remember like that being like the height of childhood religiosity for me. And then as I went into like middle school, I would say around 7th or 8th grade, I guess it was maybe a little bit earlier. It was really early for me, when I kind of took that turn. I myself have taken a staunch turnaround. I guess not complete turnaround, because there are still elements that I will get into later about my worldview that kind of result from that same time period. But whether or not they're a benefit or hindrance even now is up for debate. But I was very much the type of person who was materially oriented, in the sense that you live one life, and so you should try to get as much stuff as you wanted. It was a very materialistic, power hungry type of attitude, where it was like, okay, I want to be rich, I want to own this, I want to have that, I don't care if I'm alone, I want this and that, and all of this material things. I want a big house, I want a nice car, and really what it boiled down to is I want a good career with lots of money, and those are very materialistic things. And so that kind of took over my worldview, in thinking that nothing else mattered, that there was nothing else that mattered besides these materialistic endeavors that you could embark on and get, and that would be the end all be all, because by the time you accomplish it, you would die. And so that was essentially my goal as a kid. And I will say that was what set me on the path for a real estate career, was because I knew that, I talked to my dad about it, and he's kind of the same way, like, I guess a little bit different in how he goes about it. He's not as fervent as I was as a kid, but how as a kid, you hyper focus on the little things. You hyper obsess onto the little things that are really cool to you. So that kind of overtook my worldview for the next few years. But it did set that career in motion, that career path, which I'm still, intending to develop as time goes on, and even I'm in the process of doing so. So it's there are still results that I feel today from that, but that took over my life then, and it really was this notion of I don't care. I was very much a Machiavellian oriented kid and teenager, without any higher reference to more holistic and moral or absolute or whatever it may be, principles of that sort. So I guess what I can say is what pulled me back is that even then I still had some philosophic disagreements with modernity, in the sense that I would always try to abstract things and trace it back to the fundamental origin and source. And I know that science tries to do the same thing with like the Big Bang and things like that. But this was different for me. It was kind of analytical in a sense, where it was like, okay, well, this is put in motion because of this, which is put in motion because of this, which is caused because of that. And it just kept abstractifying until I was looking at things as they were essentials in a sense, and not necessarily as they are, or as they are now. So another part was that was a worldview that I had my whole life, which kind of contradicted with the materialistic thing, but as an aside. And then there was also the part where I disagreed fundamentally with various elements and various things that were being pushed within society, that I didn't know how to express my disagreement with. I knew that I disagreed.
I forgot to mention that.
Yeah. I knew that I disagreed, but I couldn't explain why. It was like an intuitive other. It was an intuitive opposition to whatever it was that was being pushed, like in modernity. And another thing I realized as I kind of grew up and went to high school, and history became more prominent in classes and things like that, I would realize that every time that in history class that society took some drastic step into the world of, into quote unquote progress, I would have some fundamental opposition to it in my head, where it was like, I was like, oh, so that's what caused this problem, that caused this problem, that caused this, in a domino effect like that. So no matter where it was in history, I was like, why do I oppose these progressive changes in history, which results in the society that we live in now, and which were maybe in principle ultimately good changes? Like, for example, you have...
Well, Weimar Germany was very progressive.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I guess I
wouldn't call anything they did beneficial, though.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that, in a sense, even where there were areas of progress that could have been beneficial in a principled sense, that could have been good in a principled sense if it took a different form, or if it was done for a different reason, the way in which these steps were made, I had an opposition to, because the sentiment behind it and the reason for its implementation was to detract from something that was more absolute. But I couldn't describe it that way. I couldn't tell you why. But I noticed that I had
so
that.
Was it like the principle and the principle, the enactment, and then the ideal of all of these things were all in conflict with each other in a type of way?
Exactly. Yes. It was like I could tell you something that would be morally correct, but if I told you that it was morally correct and someone else said that it was morally correct, we would be saying it for two different reasons, and it would be justified with two different sets of semantics, kind of like we were talking about.
Yeah.
And but I wouldn't be able to wouldn't be able to articulate my point of view on that. So I would just look at the whole broad spectrum as negative. You know what I mean? And so reading various philosophers, getting interested into history, getting interested into politics, and thinking like, okay, why do I oppose these things? Why do I oppose everything? Why do I oppose at the very least everything? What it really came down to...
Am I just a contrarian?
Yeah,
question
exactly.
For every reactionary.
Exactly. And it was why do I oppose everything? And I didn't like that I wasn't able to espouse what I supported, because I really don't like to be negative. I like to be positive in the sense that I like to... I don't really care about bashing, quote unquote, bashing my enemies. I care more so about supporting what I like, what I enjoy, or what I think is correct. But I couldn't quantify or characterize or even describe what it was that I did support. Mostly because I was still stuck in this staunch atheistic phase or agnostic phase that I wasn't able to get out of just because of the semantics that I had given myself. You know, I was still operating on anti-traditional semantics while, coming at the issue of progress and, history and things like that with a traditional worldview. So it was like I had a traditional worldview legitimized by anti-traditional semantics. It was very difficult to try to rationalize with myself. And eventually I got into reading various philosophers, and it kind of snuck up on me when I read Julius Evola, when I read his book. Revolt Against the Modern World was a very staunch awakening at the fact that, okay, so it was like the final push into religiosity. It was that book alone. And then after I finished, I went to his what do you call him? His master, I guess, his spiritual master. Guénon. I went to him, and I read, because Evola was a lot more political in his writings. He focused very much on the political sphere and the social hierarchy and things like that. Whereas while that may be an interest to me, in some sense, I was more interested in understanding things beyond that sphere. And so I went to Guénon, and he has writings of you can't even count so many different things which you come across within various religions and mythologies and things like that, which I guess I should also touch upon. I was very interested in lore and mythology, which I kind of mentioned before, especially into my latter teenage years. I was very interested in lore and mythology, and so all of these elements kind of coalesce into thinking like, okay, now I'm set on the right path. It almost felt like when you crack your back and it feels like you're snapping something back into place, or you snap your knee back into place. That's what it felt like when I had that type of like aha moment. And ever since then, I've just been, kind of reinforcing not only just a belief, but a sense of knowledge with, various philosophers from, after Guénon, I went to the Everyone in the Perennialist School first. And then beyond them, I went to other, like, more esoteric or more individual philosophers, I guess you could go back in religiosity and you can find Thomas Aquinas. I went through the whole Catholic line. Meister Eckhart, I went through him, all the way back. And I kind of, like, deconstructed history, and I kind of ended with Plato and Aristotle, and that's kind of where I'm at now. Plotinus as well.
And went in reverse, huh?
Yeah, went in reverse, exactly. And going through all these things, it was like, one of the things that I feel like teaches me a lot of new information and helps me get the bigger picture is when you read someone and you read the bibliography and you read the sources and the citations and stuff, then you go and actually check out the sources that they pulled from. That's kind of how it brought me back, because it's like, okay, well, Guénon would reference this 19th century thinker who would reference this 16th century thinker who got his ideas from, the Renaissance, and I guess 17th century is Renaissance, right? And then, you go back to Plato. It's like a constant citation. And so there's a train of following these various citations back to older philosophers. But yeah, my understanding now of religion and stuff like that, it is very philosophic and almost mathematical in a sense. It's it's very philosophic and mathematical. But what I mentioned earlier with the material disposition and the orientation that I was in when I was a kid, which was that very pragmatic utilitarian type of, you can't be wasting time. I still believe in that to a certain extent. And one of the things that I wanted to touch upon this episode, I have it written down here, is that materialism has a place in a holistic worldview, in a sense that it can be described as pragmatism. For politics, it can be described as realpolitik. For, for production and stuff, it can be considered as utilitarian and whatnot. And there are some moral thresholds which you shouldn't be crossing with that philosophy. But there is a place for this in a more holistic worldview. And so,
like how I said, the bridging of the physical solution for a spiritual problem type deal, right?
Exactly, yeah. The kind of ends justify the means, so long as the ends are justified themselves. It's less morally gray, while still having that air of pragmatism and consequentialism. That, in a sense, that you look at things as they are, materially and metaphysically. You look at things as they are, not necessarily what you want them to be or what you think they should be, and then you use what you can to do what you know is right. That's kind of where I'm at now. But
I think that's.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, because I just wanted to make sure that we don't lose what you had just said too on where you were in that sort of phase, that in between of like, I'm constantly seeing things wrong with society and how they're progressing completely outside of my control, and I don't know why I feel they're wrong, but something is screaming at me that there is something fundamentally egregious here. Not necessarily going so far as to say they're evil, but I mean, we would now, because we've crossed that precipice. But before we did, we'd be like, there's something off here. And so many people, like I've mentioned, are in that position now, where they may have an idea that there is a man behind the curtain, so to speak, or that there are other things going on that have very dire consequences that instinctually you'll be opposed to, but they haven't, or they're unwilling to cross that gap, jump that or take that leap of faith and cross over into that realm of spirituality again, like I mentioned with Jordan Peterson, or with Adam and Sitch and so many other people, or that atheist fellow I was talking to. Even if they might recognize that there are some problems fundamentally with the world, or some issues that are being ignored, or so on and so forth. And that's what I really wanted to get at, because we've found ourselves, or we found ways out of that mentality ourselves. Maybe not fully, but we're well on our way past the point we were before, where most people have stagnated, and it's getting a solution now to help get those people who can be rehabilitated and can be helped across that gap, because they do have to make that jump. It's not just a walk or finding a bridge to get over there. You have to kind of take a good leap over what would be a precipice that you could fall down and then steep into that nihilism, and ultimately probably commit suicide or something like that, like so many people have been doing in modernity. And it's finding that solution now, which I'm hoping we can, maybe we won't solve right here and now, but that hopefully we can start to approach.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And what you're saying is that, it really does kind of correspond and relate back to that idea of, like you said, finding material solutions, or bridging the gap, I guess, between material solutions and spiritual solutions. While there may be a sort of disposition, like we've talked about, with a sort of, we have this kind of intuitive opposition to various stages of progression, which may come about, and yet not be able to understand or articulate why. That's exactly what I think we need to be able to that's what I think that our main goal should be, is trying to articulate why, and then finding others who have yet to articulate why, to help them see if, kind of, I guess, if they agree, or at the very least, find some kind of purpose in or method to the madness, so to speak. And
that's why I always say that Peterson was so influential on helping me kind of take that leap, even though he himself hasn't, because he from a psychological standpoint would explain the whys and why certain things were the way they were, and how biblically they were depicted, and how accurately that biblical portrayal was, because it was a very from a material standpoint, and even from a material standpoint, this is stretching the bounds of the material purview, is that the biblical dictations were a collective wisdom of society, and these guidelines that you'd be guided by to avoid getting to avoid falling down that precipice. And that's where I kind of retroactively started looking at issues that the Bible was ultimately right on, or that these religious people were ultimately right on, and then slowly were subverted or consumed themselves by this machine of modernity. And at least from a psychological material standpoint of things, you could get people to start accepting that. And that's what happened to me and what I did, and what Peterson kind of helped me with in other regards, as well as other points of data that came about, because I was so steeped in the sciences and wanted to view things in that analytical mind, much like you were saying, Vincent, with the metaphysically mathematical in a way. And it was very much like that, but at a certain point, you kind of got to just go, okay, well, the biblical or spiritual side of things has been right about X, Y, Z, alpha, omega, beta, everything else in between, and it will continue to go so even as the quantity side of things may start slowly catching up to it. But it was always true from the outset, and the quantitative means is only a way to hopefully convince people on that material purview to go, hey, the solutions were already there, and this data is only backing that up. You have to make that jump, otherwise you'll just be stuck in the same cycle of degeneracy that will only devolve further and spiral downward.
Right. And you know what you're mentioning right now, especially with, like, you mentioned how you might make a change qualitatively, and then it will take the quantitative side of things a little bit to catch up. That kind of that's what I mean when I reference that hourglass analogy with the sand and the quality. I mean, you could substitute semantics for a change in policy. Right. No, you're good. You could substitute semantics for a change in policy, or a change in one thing or another, and the sand would very much still fall into that category as soon as the hourglass is flipped. But it takes a little bit for the sand to catch up. So, where you may change one thing that people with a religious worldview would be against, and may not be able to articulate it because they are, in a sense, even, especially people of, especially followers of organized religion, very much are that common cast, the reason for the necessitation of an institution itself, of an organized religion. So it's almost like there is no way to teach everybody to articulate that, because everybody has varying levels of intelligibility, and people don't really care about that type of stuff. So it's very difficult to try to have them be able to articulate the positions in the same way that someone who's well studied on it. I wouldn't even say like us, but people who are beyond us, people who have devoted their entire lives to this stuff, might be able to do. And I think we do a pretty good job at it. But at the same time,
I think we're still very young in that regards too. So we have a long ways away.
Yeah, we do a better job than most, but not as good of a job as we can, and it will constantly get better. But the common cast folks who, for whom organized religion is made, won't be able to articulate these things. But as soon as a policy is changed that they dogmatically oppose, just by nature of following the word of God, which the Bible was written by folks who did have that type of knowledge, folks who were able to articulate it, and they were able to articulate it so well that they, even if you take the Bible not verbatim, but as a chronology of various mythologies or of various myths that signify and symbolize a certain position or another, that's how they were able to describe it, and it was done in such a good fashion that people are able to read it, understand it, and follow it. And they knew what was going on. They knew why certain things were wrong. And so, while you may be looking at this, caricature of a modern evangelical and thinking, okay, well, he doesn't understand anything. Okay, well, he might not understand something himself, but he follows a group that was made by people who did understand. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's being guided by the principles that he may not be able to re-articulate to you, but he doesn't need to, because those principles have been instantiated by far wiser men for millennia.
Yeah.
And that's why, one, they've survived, and two, why they're helpful at all.
Exactly.
But even despite that, is like we're still going in the materials, like psychological realm of things. When you actually make that jump over into the spiritual, you come to realize that, it wasn't just men that wrote this. These were at the very least divinely inspired or dictated from this monad, this universal principle, this God that is at the end of the day the alpha, the omega, the beginning and the end. It is this thing that we recognize and we kind of manifest in our own lives as men, and that's what comes about in these questions that we ask that are beyond those scientific means of quantifying. And so we take that wisdom or this principle or these rules laid out to us by what's been given to us or by what we've recognized from the divine as is, and try to adhere to them. Even though they may be ideals that we won't be able to live up to, there's still something we can try and approximate, because it is something not beyond our understanding, but beyond our physical capabilities. And that's why I kept saying is that there needs to be a bridging of the gaps between the physical problems, because at the end of the day, they're all physical problems, because that's the realm in which we interface with. But physical solutions, but the essence of it is a spiritual problem, a spiritual question, and we need to take those spiritual answers and translate them into physical reality. We need those men of action to enforce or to pioneer or to go forth and conquer at the end of the day, being guided by these principles, being guided and truly believing, truly being religious towards, sincerely embodying these ideas, not just on an intellectual basis or being sort of standoffish and, it's probably most likely true. No, like really viciously, fervently manifesting, like our ancestors had, having that spirit, that veracity, that bravery and everything else behind their actions, because they were truly guided and probably closer to those ideals, those spirits, those divine truths that may have been actually presented to them through these horrors and glories of an ethereal what's the word?
like a presentation
destination.
or a presence or um
Origin. There we go. From this
yeah.
ethereal origin, these
Yeah.
magnificent cosmic horrors and glories that we witness, and we might misinterpret at times. That's why we do refer to things in like the monad. It's as true as we see Christianity, we recognize that it is lacking in some areas,
It's still
and
a form.
also, yeah, it's still a form where we have the historical presence of Christ too, in all his miracles and whatnot, and the miracles set forth and acts set forth by the people who then preceded him. So there's some evidence to like instantiate our faith as well as to why, okay, this thing's probably legit. But beyond that, that can still kind of be misinterpreted in ways, and divisions come about, and that's why we see all these different sects and reiterations and interpretations and different churches coming about entirely. And so we can't just be dogmatic in a way on this one particular thing. As true as Vincent and I and many others would probably say, like, yeah, this is, there's still room for error in our own interpretations and manifestations as men. But as much as we can approximate that ideal, that Christ-like vision, that novus civis, as we put it, incorporating the different spiritual manifestations of these cosmic truths from all different world religions that have had these exposures to the divine, that's what will help us in manifesting these solutions. But it can't just be the spiritual, it can't just be the ethereal or intellectual from our side of things. We have to figure out that translation into the practical, pragmatic, material, quantifiable, and have evidence presented to reinforce these things. As true as we know them to be already, there are other people that need convincing from a different perspective, or, like I said, a rehabilitation back into the spiritual from that void of nihilism, or to a lesser degree materialism that we see plaguing society.
Yeah, I agree. And, touching upon that last little bit that you said, it was one of those things that I had to put a lot of thought into when developing when developing this concept for the doctrine, because another derivation, or I guess another difference between folks like the traditionalists or the perennial school and praxis philosophy and what we have written down in our doctrine is that the reign of quantity, or the idea of quantity, isn't so much presented in the doctrine as it is even in the perennialist school. And what I mean by this is that there's this idea of two orders to reality, like a metaphysical order and a physical order. And I feel like the problem is this differentiation itself. The number two itself is a quantity, and it is relative, and so all of quantity is relative. And one problem that I think people face, especially when seeing these things, is that these solutions, or I guess these issues, are of a reality that is one. And that's why the monad is so important, is because it is one. There is not two orders to reality. There is one reality within which there are multiple orders, if that makes sense. And that's the problem, is that differentiating it between physical and metaphysical can kind of what's another word for cheapen? It doesn't cheapen.
It dulls.
Yeah, I guess
dilutes.
Dilutes or limits the effect. Whatever it does, it disconnects metaphysics from physics, and it kind of imposes a presupposition that what is metaphysical and what is physical are two different things, where where I kind of tried to rectify that was by trying to kind of unite the two and saying that one is a manifestation of principle, but in theory, everything here would be principle. I think all of the conclusions that can be made, like the most. Yeah, let me pull up something because I just wrote something down.
I think I get what you're saying though, is where there is that oneness to the world, and trying to separate these things and delineate them ultimately harms us. But in the practical sense, you have to give people a pragmatic conception of the world, so that it's people have their nice little categories that they can associate and understand in easier terms. But that's what you're getting at right now, is us getting closer to the end of that maze.
Yeah.
And getting closer to the truth of things, where it's like, okay, there is this oneness, and metaphysics and physics have overlap, those bleeding edges, like we said at the onset of the video.
Exactly. And I did write something to this degree as well, which says, it essentially says, and like you're saying, it is closer to that conclusion. But what I wrote was, all esoteric religious or spiritual understanding is fundamentally based around symbology. One of the conclusions at which only one with the highest understanding can arrive at from most esoteric knowledge is that physical reality is nothing but a symbol and a dramatization of the interaction between various metaphysical principles and forces, and that all experiential information is a way of transposing an awareness of these interactions to the various principles comprised in every physical manifestation. Now, to alleviate the headache that sentence gives you, what I essentially mean by this is that as you kind of progress in understanding religiosity and things like that, you tend to become aware that where the dimensions are concerned, coming from monad to dyad to triad and all of that, and the forms which principles take, you can kind of consider physical reality as a form that these principles do take. It is essentially relative. It is relative. It is conditioned within the confines of time and space, and itself, it can be considered a manifestation of a principle. So if you were to look at it, oh man, I don't want to say like deconstruct it, because you deconstruct things and it becomes physical particles like atoms and things like that. But in a more philosophic sense, you can be considered as a person to be made up of various principles which constitute your personality, if that makes sense. So personhood would be decided by, you are an offspring of the principle of your ancestor's spirit, right? That's number one. You're a manifestation of the principle of humanity. You're a manifestation of the principle of whatever caste it is that you're part of. Manifestation of the principle of, even it could be like lesser and more relative principles, like whatever it is that makes up your personality. All of these are abstract essential principles that make you up as a whole, and you are the physical manifestation of these principles. So in a sense, in the same way that you are made up of atoms, you are also made up philosophically and metaphysically as principles, which these atoms represent. That's kind of like the end all be all understanding that I have gathered, and I see this across the board with various understandings and philosophers and things like that, all come down to things being symbols of one another, and that reality is, or physical reality itself, is a symbol of principles made up of atoms. So in the same way that a symbol would be made up of ink to represent something, this is just a bigger version of that. And I sat on that for a while. Oh, go ahead.
To reiterate that in a way that some other people might be better able to understand, would it be like your body right now, in a material sense, being the manifestation of your spirit's will over the material world kind of deal?
Yes, essentially, yes. Like for example, we can dive into it a little bit. What would the principle of humanity look like? Like what does a principle look like? It looks like nothing. So very obviously there has to be something to represent that principle. And so that would be what we are. And so various things don't have a representation physically. So that must mean that physical representations must be representative of multiple things, of a multiplicity of things. So that's why things being traced back to their origin is so important, because humanity might not just be one singular principle itself, one individual or one differentiatory principle from another. It might be made up of a whole bunch of principles. It might be sourced back to a whole bunch of different things. You can pick it apart and find the principles which are like the various building blocks of the single individual principle of humanity, which is represented by the man. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it actually makes perfect sense. And as I'm thinking about it, it makes God make much more sense as you put it in those terms, because you could consider God as the principle.
Exactly.
And then
exactly.
From the fabric of God, all these other principles derive, and ourselves derive, which is why you also liken them to like the Father, or where more primitive concepts, like the paganistic concepts, would things like a mother, or the soul. Soul as in son from ancient translations of
Right.
Greek, and things like that.
Yeah.
And so it'd be like that fabric, and then all these other symbols are. When you put it in these terms, now I don't have the language to properly manifest it, but it makes sense in my head.
Exactly.
Like everything you just said makes sense in this weird proto language that we all have in our minds, and then we can't express it. And I'm like, oh man.
Exactly. Like, for example, why are we different? Like, I guess the philosophic or esoteric explanation of why do I exist and why do you exist differently? It would be because there are some principles which are consisted in me that are not consisted in you, and vice versa. There are some that are consisted in you and not consisted in me. And the commonalities that we have are the ones that are manifest in both of us. Like, we're both humans. We both are embodiments of the masculine principle. We are both we're both of European descent, that type of thing. So we both have the same origin in certain areas, but we're both manifestations of different things as a result of various amalgamations. So the sentence I wrote after that is, all physical bodies or manifestations themselves should be understood as the amalgamations of the various extensionary quote-unquote offspring of various principles, and thus as symbols which correspond to not one but many principles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. But yeah. Anyways, I don't remember why I got onto that rant, but
I'm glad you did it, mate. Like, that really.
That's why.
That kind of shocked me a bit mentally.
Yeah. That's why. Because if you look at things like this, if you look at things with this worldview, the multiplicity of realities, metaphysics and physics and all of that stuff, it becomes one. And so there is no longer a metaphysical and a physical. There is I want to say there is a metaphysical, but it makes, you get what I'm saying. There's the
meta principle.
Yeah, there's a meta principle. Exactly. And it really helps to picture that we are living within something instead of without something, or outside of something, that we all derive from this fundamental one. Another good way of describing it, this is an explanation that I heard from that video of theology that I described before, was that before you consider time and consider results, you can consider a God as the unmoved mover. So, for example, if you were to push, like, let's say you have your hand on your mouse and you push your mouse. Now, you could say that your hand is pushing your mouse, but as soon as your hand stops, the mouse stops. but what is pushing your hand? Okay, the various nerves within your hand is pushing your hand. So you can say that the nerves are in turn pushing the mouse. But what is pushing your nerves? Well, it's your will. Okay, so your will is pushing your nerves, which is pushing your mouse. Okay, so what is pushing your will? And you trace this back, and all of this is happening right now because the second that your will decides to stop, the mouse stops, you know? So
not even just the second, because that's quantifying it in too larger terms, but the instant.
The instant that your will stops, the mouse stops. And so if you trace this back to the most fundamental, you don't even have to consider time, because time is not of the essence here.
Yeah.
But literally, so let's say your will stops. Okay, well, why does your will stop? Because something else up there has told it to stop. So the idea is that instead of God being this ultimate cause in a chronological sense, God is the ultimate cause of movement as it exists right now, and as it will always exist. That is the most fundamental mover. And so as things are in motion, each of these things has a fundamental source that is pushing them. That would be what we consider God. And when I heard it put like that from this video, I was like, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. That makes a whole lot of sense.
It also kind of puts that dichotomy, like how we were putting in that quantity of splitting things up. Whereas it's always what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Well, fundamentally, they would have to be the same thing.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
Just in like realms of physics or in metaphysics, I know we're falling back into the things we just said not to do, but
yeah,
being practical here.
Yeah,
the momentum thereof and the inertia, everything else behind it, they'd have to be both, and that's what you can kind of consider that meta principle in a way, that God as we would have him, because it is whatever we'd want to call it, moving everything and being unmoved at the same time. It just is, and that's why it kind of defies the material logic or rules of our material world, because it is beyond just the material, and that's why we're that's what I mean in the proto language in our head. It makes sense, like just the raw thought of it, and we really need to just start making up words on
the fly.
These episodes,
exactly.
Because there's no way to describe it other than just making something up Shakespearean style.
Yeah. Another good idea, another good way to conceptualize it, that whole idea of physical reality as like as a symbol of various principles would be, imagine if you had one seed for a tree, and you plant that tree and it grows and it has a whole bunch of various offspring, and for some reason the seeds are of a different type from this tree. Now you plant another seed from that same tree and it grows into, I don't know, wheat or something. And then you plant another seed and it grows into grass. And so now you have wheat and grass are their own individual principles, which stem from the source of that primordial tree. It's that same idea with principles themselves. And then eventually,
I just thought of another way to do it in ways of like lineage too.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas as the fundamental essence that we're getting at in like you were saying, well, what moves your will type deal, once you are to be, then you are this mosaic in a kind of deal. And I've heard this explained in I think some post online from years ago, where you are a complete mosaic with like this infinite resolution that comes in, getting to maybe like fractals in a way, and I'll get to that in a second, where this image of you is like this mosaic made up of individual parts that have this infinite resolution going in, and of that is made of different people or places or influences or experiences that make up you manifestly in your essence. And then the people who've come before you are represented within your own mosaic at a lower resolution, but are a whole point or series of points within that perception of or manifestation of yourself as well. But they all deride from that same fundamental essence in which everything is manifested from.
Right.
And then say your children or going down the line of progeneration are the same way, where you are a piece of their mosaic now, and the piece that is represented within them of yourself is a lower resolution mosaic too, but fractally it still exists wholly within just them being.
Yeah.
Like and that's that sort of genetic imprint, but also that spiritual sort of just taught in a principle of being too, where it's you are your father and your mother in a way, genetically, and separated from them you'll still be kind of like them, but then there's the aspect of them imprinting themselves upon you in behavior and action and in speech and a whole bunch of different other things that exists, and then going back further that stretches to that essence, that fundamental being that we can conceive of as God, that we're getting at.
Exactly. Yeah. But beyond this, there is one more thing I wanted to touch upon, was that there are some. This is a little bit of an easier topic to go on, but there are some who kind of. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that there were some who use the Kali Yuga, but have no real refutation for the principles which are embodied by the Kali Yuga. There's a quote here from Julius Evola himself, who says. He says, in all this concern, there's generally very little that goes beyond the amateurishness of intellectuals. It would be all too easy to show how often these views lack true principles, and how what is being rejected is often still subconsciously retained by those who wish to react, and how for the most part, people do not really know what they want, since they obey irrational principles. This is especially true on the practical plane, where we find violent and chaotic expressions typical of a protest that wishes to be global, though it is inspired only by the contingent and terminal forms of the latest civilization. There are some who... this is me speaking now. But there are some who characterize the Kali Yuga, or reference the Kali Yuga, as the era in which we're living, and then offer no true solution themselves. It's almost done with a rhetorical sense, in the same way that in the same way that people can't get past using the word spirit or spiritual in a rhetorical sense. The spirit of this or the soul of that is used to kind of rhetorically emphasize an element of something, like for example the spirit of America would be freedom and democracy and all of that stuff, right? It's that same idea. That's a rhetorical appeal.
Just as a quick thing, that atheist fellow that spurred on this whole thing that I was talking with had that same contention around faith. And he said, no, I don't use faith. I absolutely refuse to operate under faith in any ways. And I'm like, well, rhetorically, just by definition, you can't. And he's like, no, I don't operate under faith whatsoever. I operate under data or evidence or things like that. And I'm like, that's not how it works, like just pragmatically in life whatsoever. But he had this refusal to use this word because of its other connotations surrounding it, and I think that's what you were kind of getting at too.
Yeah, that, and then there's also not a true understanding of what the actual issue is that needs to be solved. For example, there are some who say that we need to have this type of spirituality, or I guess the better way to describe it is that there are people who use religiosity for political reasons, and then there are people who understand religiosity on its own holistically, and then kind of come to a, I guess you could say, a political disposition or opinion because of that. There is one which religion is contingent, and there is one which the actual contingent principle is contingent. And what we see today is much of the former type, where instead of using religion to justify certain political positions or social positions or whatever it may be, they use these positions themselves to justify having a religious worldview. It's almost like they're scrambling for pieces of evidence to use to substantiate a worldview which really isn't substantial in itself, which is why they need so much evidence to grab it.
And I think that's a bit what we were trying to demonstrate with the pagan conversation and in the reconciliation thereof, because it seems much the case that those who try to latch on to these ancient ideals of paganism, especially in the Indo-European sense, fall into very much that category, despite the progression of history as we know it.
Yeah, it is actually, because there are a lot of and it's not just on one side, it's on both sides, especially with neo spirituality and things like that. It's a lot of it is politically motivated, on both sides of the political spectrum. And the problem with this is that there is no true opposition to, the actual Kali Yuga, the actual problem. And a lot of what they support is not really a return to tradition, as the meme goes, but a return to what is natural. And that's not to say that that's not to say that they don't go hand in hand, but you can live a relatively natural life while not living a traditional life, in the sense that you are not fulfilling certain principles, you are not actualizing certain things which need to be, which is kind of like your duty as you to accomplish or actualize. A good example.
You can see that in the New Age, the New Age type of folk as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is literally on all sides. A good example of this would be people who already are oriented from a psychological standpoint. A lot of the problems is that, a lot of quote unquote traditionalists orient themselves from a humanist, psychological, natural standpoint, justifying themselves sometimes with religious principles and pulling, and cherry picking various texts to substantiate their ideas, while they offer no true alternative on their own and only offer a critique of what they oppose. Does that make sense? So it's like you said, they put their anchors down and it's almost there. It's in the right direction, but then it deviates onto the wrong path for a little bit. The folks who are very the meme and prim, or being a primitivist.
Yeah.
It's that type of individual who doesn't understand that while that may be natural and while that may be better physically for humanity to live under, more satisfying to his brain, and it's the conditions which humanity is dispositioned to live under, that doesn't necessarily mean that is what is traditional. And that's the problem, is that nature doesn't equate to tradition. Tradition equates to tradition. And
that's why I think Uncle Ted is so influential nowadays, because he points out all the things that are going wrong in that area, but then he kind of draws the wrong conclusion, which other people hop onto as well, because he has such a concise and confident way of articulating it, where he neglects the fact that there will always be a technological advancement of humanity, and that there will always be a conquest of nature just by our own nature. And that is something, as under Praxism, under our doctrine, what we do try to reconciliate and acknowledge, in that there are artificial and synthetic aspects to our society that we have now that are completely detrimental to humanity and the world as it exists. But there are fundamental percepts to our being that, interfacing with physical reality, spiritually, we will always drive and strive to conquer or overcome or manipulate in some certain way. There's just better ways of going about it that aren't essentially suicidal in their pursuit.
You what you were mentioning with Ted, that is the quintessential example of what I mean by making a psychological argument in favor of tradition by making a critique of the enemy and offering little in opposition beyond a reduction in technology. That's exactly my problem with him. it's not that he's not a smart guy. It's that it was a misguided. It was a misguided end. It was a misguided conclusion, and I think he's one of those that is, like I said, who's almost there, who may not be able to articulate what it is spiritually that he believes, but I'm inclined to believe that it's not necessarily the spiritual battle that him and his ilk are waging, quite literally in his sense.
Going back to the maze symbology, is he got pretty far down the maze in certain respects, and he showed people like us, our generation, where not to go and the general direction of where to point to. And now it's on our shoulders to get further down the path of the maze off of the work that someone like Ted did do. He got some things wrong, but he had the general pointers of where we ought to be heading. And that's I think what we need to take from that. And that's what we try to do holistically in all areas of these perennial traditions.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think as well. And when it comes to the issue of technology, because I know that comes up a lot. The issue with me, at the very least, is not so much with technology, because theoretically, like in theory, you could have a traditional society that is technologically advanced. As long as all of the correct elements are in place, the technology itself doesn't really matter. And then, on the flip side, you could also have a very naturalistic but very anti-traditional society, in the sense that you could have some maybe like hunter-gatherer tribes that don't practice the rites, that don't care about having a society, as it were, or are maybe very egalitarian and interchangeable themselves. You could definitely have that, theoretically, obviously. And that's exactly the problem with hyper-focusing on the technological issue itself, I think, is that, yes, while we may have a problem with technology, the problem is not with technology itself. It's with humanity's usage of technology, its attitude towards technology, its reliance upon technology. And so I feel like, that's another one of those misguided attempts at looking at a spiritual problem and trying to give it a physical solution. The solution would be just, remove all the technology. It falls into that trap of thinking very linearly. Like, okay, if science and technology equals progress and I don't like progress, well, that means that I like no technology, no science. That means I want to regress. I want to go backwards. And that's not necessarily the right idea to grab. It's falling into that dualistic trap, that quantitative trap of saying, okay, well, it can't be one, then it must be the other. It's that.
Here's a fun way of putting it.
Yeah.
Techno-Amish mecha primitivists. There you go.
Yes. Yes. But yeah, that kind of goes into another idea that I was actually probably going to make a video on, when it comes to like equitarian dyads and things like that. But the idea itself is that it's focusing on a relative issue, thinking that removing the relative issue will solve the absolute problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think that about wraps it up. Would you say?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. Do you have any conclusive statements?
I kind of want to let Techno-Amish mecha primitivists be my cherry on top for the episode.
That is very Cody of you. It is very Cody. All right. Well, I would like to thank everybody for tuning into today's podcast. This was a good one. I really enjoyed it. Make sure you check out the links below, where you can find all of our social media pages and other goodies like that. If you would like to join us and converse with us, or maybe contact us to be on the podcast, the link for that will be in the description as well. Thank you once again, Cody.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you all for joining. And one last thing, too, with checking out our links and everything like that. If you do tune in regularly and recognize many of the names we do drop and the people that we have taken inspiration from, please, by all means, try and we get try to get in contact with people as well to share these ideas. Like we brought on Yiz a few months back. If you can, reach out and let some people know about us, and that we have these ideas, and that we are trying to find solutions to these problems that everyone is asking.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
by all means, help
Definitely.
us out just a little bit if you can.
Definitely. But yeah, I think that about wraps it up. So without further ado, my name is Vincent, and thank you for joining us on this week's Praxist Table Talks.